John had never seen a planet like this before. The sky was a dull shade of gray, and the ground was cracked and barren. Everything seemed lifeless, except for the faint hum of distant machines and the occasional screech of alien creatures in the distance. He had landed on this alien world after a malfunction in his ship had forced him to make an emergency landing. Now as he walked through the empty market street, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air smelled stale, almost metallic, and the ground under his boots crunched with every step. John was used to alien planets by now. He had traveled across many of them during his years as a space engineer, but this place felt different. It wasn't just the quiet, eerie atmosphere that unsettled him. It was the sense of emptiness, as if the entire planet had been abandoned. Yet, he could see signs of life, just barely. Shadows moved in the distance, but no one came near him. They seemed to avoid him like he was some kind of ghost. His eyes scanned the market stalls, each one more dilapidated than the last. The vendors looked like they hadn't seen a customer in ages, with their dusty wares left untouched. Some tried to catch his eye as he passed, but none of them spoke a word. That was when he saw her dot in the middle of the street. Sitting on the cracked dirt was a small alien child. At first glance, she seemed like any other child, but there was something off about her. Her skin was a pale, sickly shade of gray, and her eyes were wide and hollow, like she hadn't slept in days. Her clothes were ragged, and her tiny hands were covered in dirt, her nails chipped and broken. But it wasn't the child's appearance that made John stop. It was what she was doing. She was eating mud. John blinked, thinking he was seeing things. The child scooped up handfuls of the dry, cracked earth and shoved them into her mouth without hesitation, as though it was the most normal thing in the world. Her face was emotionless, almost blank, as she chewed and swallowed, seemingly unaware of anything around her. John's heart skipped a beat. He had seen many strange things in his travels, but nothing like this. This child, this alien child, was starving, not for food, but for something more. What kind of world was this? How could a child be reduced to eating dirt? He stepped forward, cautiously, unsure of what to do. He wasn't sure if the child could see him, but he felt compelled to help. Gently, he called out to her. "Hey, little one," he said softly, kneeling down a few feet away from her. "What are you doing?" The child didn't react. She didn't even glance up at him. It was as if she didn't hear him at all. John's brow furrowed in confusion. Was she mute? Or was there something else going on? He reached out and touched her shoulder lightly, his fingers brushing against her cold, damp skin. The child still didn't move. Her eyes, empty and dull, remained fixed on the ground, and she continued eating the mud, oblivious to his presence. John's stomach churned with discomfort. This wasn't normal. There had to be an explanation. He gently lifted the child's chin with his finger, trying to meet her eyes. But when he looked into her face, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. Her eyes were full of emptiness, but there was also a deep sadness, a kind of resignation that no child should ever have to carry. "Hey," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this? Where is your family?" For the first time, the child blinked slowly, as though she was coming out of a trance. But instead of answering, she just stared at him with those wide, hollow eyes, as if she didn't understand the question, or perhaps didn't care enough to answer. John's heart sank as he realized that whatever was going on here was much deeper than a simple misunderstanding. This was no ordinary child. Something was terribly wrong. He stood up slowly, his mind racing. What kind of place was this? Why would a child be so alone? And why was she eating dirt like it was food? There had to be a reason for all of this, something he couldn't yet see. As John backed away, trying to make sense of it all, he noticed something strange. The child wasn't just eating dirt. She was eating the mud as if it were the only thing keeping her alive. It hit him then. This planet wasn't just a place of poverty. This was a place where survival came at a high price. John had to know more. He had to figure out what kind of world he had stumbled into, and why this child had been left to suffer. He turned to leave, but the child's eyes followed him, and, for the first time since he'd arrived, he felt the weight of something dark hanging in the air, something that made his skin crawl. The mystery had just begun. John couldn't stop thinking about the child. Her pale, frail form, sitting in the dirt eating mud, had haunted him. He had seen many strange things during his travels, but nothing had struck him like that moment. What kind of place would reduce a child to such an existence? And why was she so detached from the world around her? He knew he had to find answers. The market, once bustling with life, was eerily quiet as John made his way through the winding paths. The locals kept their distance, their eyes either avoiding him or watching him with a strange, unreadable look. As John passed, he overheard snippets of conversation, low murmurs, words he couldn't quite understand. But it was clear that whatever was happening here, the people were in fear. Fear of something he didn't yet understand. John's mind kept drifting back to the child. He couldn't shake the image of her blank eyes and the way she ate the dirt without a care in the world. There had to be more to her story, more to this entire planet's story. Determined, he set off toward a small, rundown dwelling at the edge of the market. The place had a worn, broken-down feel to it, but it was where he had seen the child's mother. She had been sitting in the doorway, looking out into the bleak horizon with empty eyes, as if waiting for something or someone. John knocked gently on the door, hoping for a response. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the door creaked open, revealing the woman from before. Her face was tired, etched with deep lines of sorrow, her eyes hollow and distant. She stared at John for a moment, as if unsure of his purpose. "Are you the child's mother?" John asked, his voice soft yet urgent. He had to know what was going on. The woman nodded slowly, her lips barely moving. "Yes, I am." John could see the pain in her eyes. He didn't need to ask her what had happened, he already knew. But he needed to hear it from her. "Why is your daughter eating dirt?" he asked, trying to keep his voice gentle. "What's going on here?" "She's so lost." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She looked away, unable to meet John's gaze. It's the only thing she can eat, the mud. It helps her survive." John's brow furrowed in confusion. "Survive? What do you mean?" The woman took a deep, shaky breath before she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I sold her voice." John blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "You sold her voice?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly in disbelief. "What do you mean, you sold her voice?" The woman's shoulders slumped, and she sat down heavily on the dirt floor inside her home. She gestured for John to sit as well. "I had no choice," she said, her voice breaking. "The water, it's scarce here. The merchants hold it all, and they sell it for a high price. My daughter, she was thirsty, so thirsty. We couldn't survive without it." John could feel the weight of her words, but he couldn't understand. But selling her voice? How does that help you get water? The woman looked down at her hands, trembling. "The merchants, they don't just sell water, they trade everything here. Everything has value. Your voice, your life, your dignity. They give you water in exchange for things that you can never get back." John's heart sank as the woman's words settled in. "So you gave up her voice, you sold her future for a drink of water?" The woman nodded, her eyes filled with regret. "Yes, the voice of a child is worth more than anything here. It's a commodity. People give up their own voices, their own worth, for water, for survival. It's the only way we can live." John felt the anger rising inside him. How could anyone, especially a mother, make such a decision? But he knew he had to stay calm to understand. And the child? She doesn't speak because she can't speak anymore, the woman interrupted, her voice tinged with guilt. The merchants took it. She can't even cry for help. I took her voice, and now. Her voice trailed off, her eyes distant as she struggled to find the words. Now she is nothing. Just a body surviving on mud. John was silent for a moment, processing the woman's words. He could feel the injustice of it, the cruelty of a system that treated voices like currency. His mind raced with questions. What kind of people would take away a child's voice? What kind of world would allow such a thing? But there was one question that burned more than the rest. Is there any way to get her voice back? John asked, his voice tight with hope. Can she be saved? The woman shook her head, tears rolling down her cheeks. No one comes back from that. Once it's gone, it's gone. And with it, any hope. John stood up, feeling the weight of her words like a physical blow. There had to be a way. There had to be something he could do. He couldn't let this continue. He couldn't leave this planet without doing something, anything to make it right. As he turned to leave, the woman's voice stopped him. Please, she said, her voice desperate. If you find a way to bring her voice back, please, don't let her suffer like this. She deserves more than this life. John nodded, a promise in his heart. He didn't know how he was going to fix this, but he would try. He couldn't let a child live in silence. With renewed determination, he set off, ready to uncover the truth of this twisted planet. John's thoughts raced as he walked away from the woman's home, the weight of her words heavy in his chest. How could anyone make the choice to sell their child's voice? The injustice of it haunted him. But now he knew what he had to do. This planet, its people, the merchants. They had to be stopped. The silence in the air felt thick, suffocating as he moved through the dilapidated streets. He had seen the way the locals moved, hunched and wary, like animals trying to avoid predators. There was no joy here, no laughter, no hope, just survival. And survival at any cost. But survival was not living. John had to get more answers. He needed to understand what kind of system this was, what kind of world he had stumbled upon. The planet's economy seemed to revolve around trade, but it was a twisted version of trade, where even voices, one of the most basic and human things, were up for sale. But why? As he walked, he kept his eyes open for anyone who might know more. He needed information, and he wasn't going to leave until he found it. After a few minutes, he spotted a group of men standing near a rickety structure that looked like a market stall. But instead of goods, there were bottles of water on display. They were the merchants. The men's eyes followed John as he approached, their expressions cold and calculating. They seemed to sense that he wasn't from around here, that he was an outsider. The kind of outsider who might ask too many questions. One of the men, tall and burly, stepped forward. His skin was a strange shade of green, marked with faint scars. And his eyes were narrow, like a predator watching its prey. Can I help you? He asked, his voice rough and guarded. John didn't hesitate. I want to know about the voices, he said, his tone steady. I've heard about how you trade them. How do you get them? And why? The man's eyes flickered with suspicion, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for John to follow him. Come, the merchant said, his voice low. I'll show you. John followed the merchant through a series of narrow alleys, their steps echoing in the emptiness. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, as though they were walking deeper into the heart of something dark and twisted. The merchant led him to a small, hidden room at the back of the market, a place that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, there was a low table with strange, alien instruments scattered across it. Some were mechanical, others organic-looking, as if they had been grown rather than built. This is where it happens, the merchant said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. He pointed to a small cylindrical device on the table. This is the machine we use to take voices. John's stomach turned as he looked at the device. It was simple, almost crude, yet it held an air of menace. The merchant saw his reaction and smiled, a cold, unsettling grin. "It's not as bad as it seems," the merchant said, his voice strangely calm. "We don't kill them. We don't harm them. We just take what's valuable, their voices." John's mind raced. Why? What's the point of taking their voices? What do you do with them? The merchant's grin widened. "You see, voices here aren't just for talking. They're power. They can be used for many things: healing, energy, control, and most importantly, water." John's heart skipped a beat. "Water?" he repeated, disbelief creeping into his voice. "You're telling me that people are giving up their voices for water?" The merchant nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Water is the most precious commodity here, and the voices are worth more than anything else. Once a voice is taken, it can be used to power the machines that bring the water. It's how we survive. It's how we control everything." John felt the anger rising inside him. This was not just exploitation, it was cruel, barbaric control. The planet's water, the lifeblood of every living thing here, was being hoarded by a few and traded for something as basic as a voice. It was hard to believe such a twisted system could exist. "How many people are giving up their voices for water?" John asked, his voice tight with anger. The merchant's eyes darkened. "More than you can imagine. Every day, people come to US begging for water. They offer anything they have, even their own voices, and we take them." John's mind was reeling. This was more than just a trade. It was a cycle of control and desperation. The people were trapped, forced to give up their very identity to survive. "You're taking away their future," John said, his voice low, barely a whisper. "These people have no choice but to suffer." The merchant shrugged, unfazed. "Suffering is a part of life, but we all need water, and I'm just providing it." John stood in silence, the weight of the merchant's words pressing down on him. How could anyone justify this kind of cruelty? And more importantly, how could he stop it? As John turned to leave, the merchant called out after him, a hint of warning in his voice. "Be careful, human. This is how things are here. You won't change it." But John wasn't ready to accept that. Not yet. He had seen enough. He had heard enough. There was no turning back now. This system needed to be stopped, and John was going to make sure of it. He had a plan, and it was time to put it into action. But first, he had to find the child. Again, he had to find a way to give her back her voice, and perhaps in doing so, he could help the entire planet reclaim its future. The harsh wind howled through the narrow alleyways of the market as John walked away from the merchant's hideout, his mind spinning with what he had learned. The weight of the information settled heavily in his chest. The planet was a place where voices were currency, and water, the most essential element, was controlled by those who held power. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just an injustice. It was a systematic form of control, built on desperation and suffering. John had seen oppression before, but this was something new. The way the people here had been conditioned to trade their very identities, their voices for the most basic of needs, it was a grim reality. And it wasn't just the child he had seen, eating mud in the streets. It was every citizen on this planet who had been silenced, whose worth had been reduced to a commodity. As he walked through the dusty streets, his thoughts turned to the mother, who had made the heart-wrenching decision to sell her daughter's voice. It wasn't just an act of desperation, it was a symbol of how far the planet had fallen. The mother wasn't just trying to survive. She was a product of a society that had been stripped of its compassion, its humanity. And if things didn't change, her daughter's fate would be the same as countless others. John paused for a moment, looking up at the sky. The clouds hung low, a dull gray that mirrored the desolation of the world below. The sun was barely visible, and the air felt thick with the weight of unspoken stories. The silence of the people around him felt suffocating, as if the entire planet was holding its breath, waiting for something to change, or perhaps too afraid to hope for it. His heart burned with anger. The planet's water supply wasn't just limited, it was intentionally hoarded, controlled by the merchants, who had found a way to manipulate the most basic of needs into a tool for power. The fact that they used voices as a form of payment made it even worse. The people weren't just starving for water. They were starving for their dignity. John's mind raced with plans, but they all felt incomplete. He had seen enough to know that the situation was dire, but how could one man take on an entire system? How could he stand against a society built on the suffering of its own people? He needed more information. He needed to understand the full scope of the situation, how deep the corruption ran, who was really in charge, and what had made this planet fall into such despair. He knew that if he didn't understand the full picture, any attempt to fight back would be futile. So he decided to seek out the most unlikely of allies, the people who had been silenced. John made his way back to the outskirts of the market, where the streets became narrower and the buildings more rundown. It was there that he found the homes of the planet's lower class, those who lived in the shadow of the merchants' greed. They were the ones who had nothing left to lose, people like the mother and child. As he walked down the dimly lit path, John spotted a group of women sitting outside a small shack. They were talking quietly, their voices hushed, as though they were afraid to be overheard. One of them, an older woman with graying hair and tired eyes, noticed him approaching. She stood up, wary but not hostile. "You're not from here," she said, her voice a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "What do you want?" "I need information," John said, his tone calm but urgent. "I need to know everything about the merchants, about the voices. I want to understand how this all works." The woman studied him for a moment, her eyes scanning him up and down. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "Why would you want to know that?" she asked. "What's it to you? You think you can fix it. You can't. No one can." "I'm not here to fix everything," John replied, his voice firm. "But I can help. I want to understand how this system works so I can stop it." The woman hesitated, then gestured for him to sit down beside her. "I'll tell you what I know," she said, her voice lowering to a whisper. "But you need to understand something first. No one here can afford to fight back. Not the way you think. We've all tried. The merchants. They've been here for so long. They own everything. The water, the land, the people. You can't just go in and change things. You can't take on their power alone." John sat down beside her, his hands clenched into fists. "Then what can we do? What's the point of living like this?" The woman sighed deeply, her eyes clouded with years of hardship. "You see, we're not just starving for water. We're starving for our voices, for our memories. The merchants know this. That's why they take our voices. Once they've taken something from you, once they've stripped you of your identity, they've got you. And once you've given up your voice, you can never get it back." John leaned forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. "But why water? Why not trade for something else?" The woman's eyes flickered with bitterness. "Water is life. Without it, we die. It's the only thing that matters to us. And the merchants know that. They've created a system where we have to beg them for the very thing that keeps us alive. And in exchange, we give them everything. Our voices, our dignity, our future." John felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The depth of the manipulation was staggering. The merchants had turned something as simple and vital as water into a weapon, one that controlled every aspect of life on this planet. But there has to be a way to fight back, John said, more to himself than to the woman. "There has to be." The older woman gave him a sad, knowing look. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but first you need to understand something. The people here, They're broken. They've given up on fighting. The merchants have won. John stood up, his resolve hardening. He couldn't accept that. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance to make things right. He had seen what the merchants were doing, and he knew what he had to do. It wouldn't be easy, and it might cost him everything. But he couldn't walk away. He turned to the woman and nodded. "I'll find a way," he said, his voice firm. "I won't stop until their voices are returned, and this planet is free." As John walked away, his heart burned with determination. The road ahead would be long and dangerous, but he was ready. He couldn't let the cycle of oppression continue. He had to be the one to break it. John's resolve burned brighter with each passing day. He had seen enough too much. The power the merchants held over the people wasn't just about water. It was about control. The voices they took weren't merely silenced. They were harvested, turned into something that could be used, twisted, and traded as currency. And with every voice that was stolen, the planet's soul was drained further. John couldn't let this continue. He had to act. And he had to act fast. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he knew about the true potential of the alien voices. Everyone had told him that they were just words, sounds, cries of life. But he had learned enough by now to know that this wasn't true. These voices taken from the people, from the children, from the innocent held untapped power. What if the merchants had been holding back something? What if the voices weren't just a way to power machines? What if they were the key to everything? A way to overthrow the merchants once and for all? John couldn't shake the thought. And then, one day, as he wandered deeper into the forgotten parts of the marketplace, he overheard a conversation that made the pieces fall into place. A group of old women were sitting together near a rundown shack, their voices low, their eyes flickering with the wisdom of years spent under the merchant's rule. John was careful to stay out of sight, but he could hear enough. "They say the voices are the key," one of the women said, her voice cracked with age. "Not just for water, but for power, power." Another woman asked, her tone incredulous. "What kind of power?" "The kind that changes everything," the first woman replied. "The voices can heal, can control energy. But the merchants have kept it from us. They take our voices, but they never let us use them. They hoard the power for themselves." John's heart raced. He had been right. The voices weren't just for survival. They were a form of energy, a resource more valuable than water itself. But the merchants had kept the true nature of this power hidden from the people. And in doing so, they had kept them weak. "They don't just take our voices to survive," the woman continued, her voice trembling. "They use them. They've built machines that harness the energy in the voices. The voices of the children are the most powerful, pure, and untapped. But once they're taken, they can't be returned. That's why they trade them. It's not just about water. It's about control." John's mind raced as he pieced together what he had just heard. The voices, when used correctly, weren't just a means of survival. They were a force, a power that could change everything. If the merchants were hoarding this energy, they were more dangerous than John had originally thought. They didn't just control the water. They controlled the future of this planet itself. But why? Why had they kept the power of the voices a secret? What were they afraid of? As John walked away from the conversation, his thoughts were filled with more questions than answers. The power of the voices was something he had never imagined. It was more than a tool. It was a weapon, and it was time to turn the tables. John knew now that he couldn't just reclaim the voices for the people. He had to show them what those voices could do. He had to teach them how to wield the power that had been stolen from them. The merchants had used the voices to keep the planet's population subjugated. But what would happen if the people took that power back? He spent the next few days seeking out the most knowledgeable locals, the elderly, the ones who remembered a time before the merchants had arrived. Slowly, he learned more about the true potential of the voices. They could heal, as the old woman had said, but they could do more than that. The voices could be used to manipulate energy, to create force, fields to power machines. They could even affect the very atmosphere of the planet itself, altering the weather, providing rain where it was most needed, and creating protection from the harsh elements. John had stumbled upon something incredible. These voices were more than just words. They were the key to changing the planet's future, the key to taking down the merchants and restoring balance to the world. But there was a catch. The voices once taken could never be returned. That meant that John couldn't simply restore the voices to the people. He couldn't reverse the damage that had been done to the child or any other victim. What he could do, though, was harness the power of the voices that had been taken, teach the people how to channel them, and give them the strength to fight back. It would be dangerous, it would be hard, and it might cost him everything. But John knew he had no choice. The merchants had to be stopped, and the only way to do it was by using the very thing they had exploited, the power of the voices. The next step was clear. He had to confront the merchants. He had to show them that the people were no longer powerless, that their voices were not just tools of survival, but weapons that could destroy their grip on the planet. John didn't know how he was going to pull it off, but he knew one thing for certain. The people here were about to find their voices again, and when they did, nothing would ever be the same. John stood on the edge of the market, the sounds of the distant hustle and bustle mixing with the low hum of machinery that powered the planet's life-supporting systems. But as his eyes scanned the scene, he couldn't ignore the darkness that loomed over everything, the invisible chains. The merchants had wrapped around the people's lives. It had been weeks since John had first arrived, and during that time, he had pieced together enough to realize that the only way to bring about change on this planet was not through negotiation or simple rebellion. It would require something far bolder: the voices. The key to everything. But reclaiming the voices was no simple task. The merchants controlled every source of water, every commodity, every piece of technology that harnessed the energy in those stolen voices. If John was to have any hope of changing things, he needed to strike where they were most vulnerable: their power. He had spent the past few days gathering the most desperate and oppressed from the outer parts of the city, the people who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. They were the ones who had been broken, silenced, and forced into submission by the merchants. Yet, they still held something precious: the knowledge of their history, of the power the voices once held before they were stolen. John had come up with a plan, a dangerous, almost impossible plan, but it was the only one that might work. He couldn't just go into the merchant stronghold and reclaim the voices one by one. That would be a death sentence. No, he had to take the power of the voices itself and turn it back against them. He had to show the people that their voices weren't just a tool to be taken. They were a weapon that could fight back. Gathering a small group of trusted individuals, John led them deep into the heart of the city, into the forgotten places where the machines that powered the planet were hidden. The water reservoirs, the energy generators, and the voice stealing devices were all controlled by a single massive complex at the center of the market, a building that towered over everything else. It was the heart of the merchants' control, where they harvested the voices and used them for their own gain. The plan was simple in concept, but its execution would be anything but. John and his group had to infiltrate the complex, destroy the main power grid, and take control of the voice-stealing machines. That, in itself, would be a difficult task. But the true challenge lay in what happened after they broke the machines. They would have to channel the voices they had reclaimed into a force strong enough to fight back against the merchants. It's not just about breaking the machines, John explained to his group. It's about understanding the true power of those voices. They're not just words, they're energy. Energy that the merchants have been using to control everything. If we take that energy and use it against them, We can bring this whole system down." The group looked at him, a mixture of uncertainty and determination in their eyes. They had lived in silence for too long, and now John was asking them to speak once more, not just with their voices, but with the very power that had been stolen from them. Could they really do this? Could they really take back what had been taken so long ago? "I know this is risky," John continued, his voice steady, "but we don't have a choice. The longer we wait, the more people will suffer. We can't let the merchants continue to control everything." As they moved through the winding streets, John kept his focus, his thoughts centered on the mission ahead. The path was treacherous, and every corner held the potential for danger. The merchants had eyes everywhere, their enforcers constantly patrolling. But the people he had gathered were determined. They had no reason to fear anymore. They had lost everything, and now they were ready to fight. After hours of carefully navigating the city, they finally reached the complex. The building loomed over them, its dark silhouette against the gray sky sending a chill through the group. The entrance was heavily guarded, but John had already prepared for that. He had learned enough about the merchants' operations to know where their weaknesses were. "Stay low and stay quiet," John whispered. "We move in pairs. We can't afford to alert them." They crept toward the entrance, moving swiftly through the shadows, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were almost there when one of the guards spotted them. A shout echoed through the night, followed by the sound of boots thundering across the ground. The element of surprise was gone. "Go," John shouted. "We don't have time to waste." The group split, each pair heading toward different sections of the building. John moved quickly, adrenaline fueling his every step. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He had come too far to fail now. The only way to stop the merchants was to take control of their power, and he wasn't about to let anyone stand in his way. Inside the building, the machines hummed with an eerie power, their steel frames covered in alien symbols. John and his group began disabling the machines, taking out the guards one by one, using their voices not in words, but in their energy to fuel the fight. Each voice that was reclaimed sparked something in the machines, something alive, something powerful. John's heart raced as the final machine fell, its systems crashing into silence. He knew what had to come next. "Now," he whispered, gathering the group together, "we unleash the voices." He stood before the last machine, a device that had once been used to steal voices, but now was the key to their freedom. With trembling hands, John activated the control panel. The voices that had been stolen, the voices of children, of mothers, of people who had suffered, surged back into the room like a wave. The energy in the air was palpable, alive, raw, powerful. John closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the pulse of the voices as they merged into a single unified force. It was time to return the power to the people. The air in the complex crackled with energy, the raw power of the reclaimed voices humming in the room. John stood at the center, his hands raised, feeling the rush of energy coursing through his veins. The machines had fallen silent, but the power they had once harnessed was now alive, flooding the room with a force unlike anything John had ever experienced. It was as if the voices themselves had become more than just sound. They were pure energy, capable of shifting the very atmosphere around them. John's heart pounded in his chest as he concentrated. The group gathered around him, their eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. They were no longer just people living in silence. They were a force united by the power of their voices, their identities, and their will to fight back. This was no longer a battle for survival. This was a battle for liberation. "Now," John whispered, his voice trembling with both fear and hope, "we unleash the power." The voices, once stolen and silenced, began to vibrate in the air, as though the walls themselves could feel them. John could hear the distant cries of the oppressed people, the whispered dreams of a world free from fear, and the unspoken anger of those who had been silenced for so long. It was all coming to life now. He closed his eyes and focused. The energy surged, and he could feel it, the collective strength of everyone who had ever been silenced. The merchants had controlled the water, the voices, the very essence of life. But now the people had something far more powerful than the merchants could ever have imagined. As John concentrated, the ground beneath him seemed to pulse with life. The machines that had once stolen the voices began to tremble, their structures weakening. The energy that flowed from the reclaimed voices filled the complex, creating ripples of force that spread outward, like a shock wave. The sound of the collective power was deafening, not in volume but in the sheer intensity of it. It was the sound of a people breaking free. John opened his eyes, and in that moment, he felt the shift. The voices of the people weren't just being returned, they were transforming. The raw energy that had been channeled into the machines was now redirected, no longer under the control of the merchants. It flowed back into the people, into the hearts of those who had given up their voices, their dignity, and their hope. One by one, the people in the room began to speak, their voices tentative at first, then growing stronger as they realized they could. The first cry of joy rang out, and it was followed by others' laughter, shouts of victory, and finally, long overdue cries of life. The people who had once been broken were now empowered, their voices a weapon that could never again be stolen. John felt a sense of awe as the power swirled around him. This wasn't just a victory for the people of this planet, it was a rebirth. The voices weren't just for survival anymore. They were a declaration that they would no longer be silenced. The machines that had once stolen their voices began to spark and short-circuit, their systems collapsing under the weight of the energy now flowing through them. The power of the voices was too much for the merchants to control, too much for the technology they had relied on for so long. The very foundation of their empire was crumbling. Outside the complex, the effects of the uprising began to ripple. Through the city, the once lifeless streets were now alive with the sounds of rebellion. The people, empowered by their reclaimed voices, poured into the streets. They chanted, they sang, and they shouted in unison, their voices rising together. As one force, the merchants who had built their power on silence were now faced with an army of the very people they had oppressed. John stood at the heart of it all, watching as the revolution took shape. The people no longer feared the merchants. They no longer feared the silence that had been forced upon them. They had found their voices again, and with them, they had found their strength. But even as the uprising spread, John knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The merchants might have lost control over the voices, but they wouldn't give up so easily. There would be battles ahead, battles for freedom, for justice, and for the future of the planet. But now the people had something they never had before: hope. As the crowd gathered in the streets, their voices rising in a powerful chorus, John looked out at the horizon. The sky was no longer gray, but instead, it was streaked with the colors of dawn, golden and vibrant, like the first light of a new day. The planet was changing. The cycle of silence was over. And with it, a new chapter in their history had begun. John turned to the group around him, their faces filled with determination. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We've reclaimed our voices. Now we reclaim our future." And with that, they began to move forward, not as individuals, but as a united force, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. For the first time, they could face the world without fear, their voices carrying the weight of their revolution. And nothing would ever silence them again.